"We want privacy, Mom. You can't stay here." Those were the first words my son said to me after I showed up at his front door with everything I had left in 2 worn suitcases, still smelling faintly of dust and rain from what used to be my home. The tornado had come through just before dawn 2 days earlier, the kind they say only happens once in a lifetime, tearing through my neighborhood like it had something personal against us. 32 years of memories, gone in less than 5 minutes. The house where I raised Daniel, where I watched him take his first steps in the living room, where I sat by the window every Christmas morning waiting for him to wake up, reduced to splintered wood and scattered photographs buried under debris. But I didn't cry when I saw it. I just stood there on what used to be my front porch, holding on to the railing that no longer led anywhere, and told myself that a house is just a structure, that home is supposed to be people. That's why I came to Daniel. I remember standing on his porch that afternoon, the sun too bright for how heavy everything felt. His house was quiet, neat, the kind of quiet that feels intentional, like nothing is allowed to be out of place. I knocked once, then again, adjusting my grip on the suitcase handle as my fingers ached from the long bus ride. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, but not the kind of surprise that turns into relief. More like the kind that tightens your shoulders. "Mom?" he said, like he wasn't sure what to do with me standing there. I tried to smile. "My house, it's gone, Daniel," I said, keeping my voice steady. I didn't know where else to go. For a second, he didn't answer. He just looked over his shoulder, like he needed permission from someone I couldn't see yet. And then she appeared, Jessica. Perfect hair, perfect posture. That same polite smile she always wore, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just stood there beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, like they were presenting a united front. And that's when he said it. Calm, measured, like he had practiced it. "We want privacy, Mom. You can't stay here." I felt the words land before I understood them. Privacy, as if I were an intrusion, as if I hadn't spent half my life making sure he had everything he needed. I nodded slowly, because I didn't trust my voice. The wind picked up just enough to brush against my coat, the same coat I had grabbed in a hurry before leaving the wreckage behind. "I see," I said, and I meant it. Not just the words. Everything. I saw the way he avoided my eyes. I saw the way Jessica relaxed slightly once he said it, like a decision had finally been confirmed. I saw how easily a lifetime could be reduced to inconvenience. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him of anything. There are moments when you realize that saying more won't change the outcome. It will only make you smaller in someone else's eyes. So I did the only thing I had left. I tightened my grip on my suitcases, stepped back from the doorway, and gave him a small nod. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," I said. He opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to soften it. But I was already turning away. The door closed quietly behind me. Not slammed, not dramatic, just final. And as I walked down the driveway, past the neatly trimmed lawn and the flower beds I knew Jessica took pride in, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I hadn't lost my home in that storm. I had lost it long before. I just didn't know it yet. I walked until the sound of the door closing behind me faded into something distant and unimportant, but the weight in my chest did not fade with it. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually feels peaceful, but that afternoon it felt like the world had simply decided not to notice me anymore. I reached the end of the driveway and stopped for a moment, adjusting the handle of my suitcase as my fingers stiffened from the cold breeze. It was early spring, but there was still a chill in the air, the kind that settles into your bones if you stand still too long. I did not have anywhere to go. That was the part I had not allowed myself to think about while I was on the bus, watching the miles pass by and convincing myself that everything would be all right once I saw my son. I started walking again, slowly, carefully, because the sidewalk felt uneven under my feet. Or maybe it was just me. A few houses down, a woman was watering her lawn, and she glanced at me briefly before looking away. I wondered what she saw. An old woman with 2 suitcases, someone who did not belong anywhere in particular. I kept my eyes forward and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. There was a small park at the corner, one I remembered Daniel mentioning years ago when he first moved into this neighborhood. I made my way there and sat down on a wooden bench, setting my suitcases beside me. The bench was slightly damp, but I did not mind. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. For a long time, I did not think about anything at all. It was easier that way. But eventually, the memories came, not in a rush, but slowly, like something carefully placing itself back into my mind piece by piece. The house, the kitchen table where I used to drink my morning coffee, the small crack in the hallway ceiling that I always meant to fix but never did, the photo albums I kept in the closet. I wondered if any of it had survived, or if it was all scattered somewhere under broken beams and insulation, mixed in with everything else that had once made up a life. I realized then that I had not brought anything with me, except what I could carry in those 2 suitcases, a few clothes, my documents, a small framed picture of Daniel when he was about 6 years old, missing his front tooth and grinning like he had just discovered something wonderful about the world. I reached into my bag and pulled the photo out, holding it carefully between my fingers. He had been so small then, so certain that I could fix anything. There was a time when he would run to me after a bad dream, climbing into my bed and wrapping his arms around me as if I were the safest place in the world. I stared at that picture for a long moment, then placed it back in my bag. The wind picked up slightly, and I pulled my coat tighter around me. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. I knew I could not stay there forever. Benches are not meant for living, only for passing time. I looked around, searching for some kind of answer in a place that had none to offer. That was when I understood something I had been avoiding since the moment the storm took my house. Losing the structure had been sudden, violent in its own way. But losing my place in my son's life had been quiet, gradual, almost invisible. It had not happened in one moment. It had happened over years. Missed phone calls, shortened visits, polite excuses. Small distances that grew into something permanent. I had told myself it was normal, that he was busy, that life changes. But sitting there on that bench, with nowhere to go and no one waiting for me, I could no longer pretend I did not see it. I was not part of his life anymore. I was something outside of it. And for the first time, I allowed that truth to settle in completely, without trying to soften it, without trying to explain it away. The sun slipped lower and the air grew colder. I reached for my suitcase handle again, my movement slow but steady. I did not know where I was going next, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not go back to that door. I found a small bus stop a few blocks away from the park, the kind with a metal bench and a faded schedule taped to the side of the shelter, and I sat there with my suitcases at my feet, watching cars pass by without really seeing them. I did not check the route. I did not care where the bus was going. I just knew I needed to keep moving, because standing still felt too much like waiting for something that was never going to happen. When the bus finally arrived, I stepped on without hesitation, dropping a few crumpled bills into the fare box and taking a seat near the window. The driver gave me a brief glance in the rearview mirror, then pulled away from the curb. I watched Daniel's neighborhood disappear behind me, each turn of the road putting more distance between me and the door that had closed so easily. The bus was mostly empty, just a few people scattered throughout, each of them wrapped in their own thoughts, their own destinations. I wondered where they were going. I wondered if any of them were going somewhere they were not wanted. The city looked different from the bus window, less familiar, as if I were seeing it from the outside for the first time. Stores I had never noticed before, streets I had never walked down, people moving with purpose while I sat there with none. I rested my hands on top of my purse, feeling the outline of the small envelope inside it, the one I had grabbed before leaving what remained of my house. It held my documents, my identification, and a few papers I had not looked at in years. At the time, I had taken them without thinking, just another thing to save from the storm. Now I found myself tracing the edge of that envelope with my fingers, as if it might offer some kind of direction.
The bus came to a stop near a row of older buildings, and without much thought, I stood up and stepped off. The air felt colder here, the wind sharper as it moved between the narrow streets. I adjusted my coat and began to walk again, pulling my suitcases behind me as their wheels clicked softly against the pavement. After a few minutes, I noticed a small sign hanging above a doorway. A modest place, nothing special, but it had lights on inside, and that was enough. I pushed the door open and stepped into the lobby of a small motel. The man behind the counter looked up from a television mounted in the corner, his expression neutral, practiced.
"Can I help you?" he asked. I nodded. "I need a room," I said, my voice steady, even though the words felt heavier than they should have. He glanced at the clock, then back at me. "One night or more?" he asked. The question lingered for a moment, longer than it should have. I realized then that I did not know the answer. I had not planned that far ahead. "For now, just tonight," I said. He nodded and began typing into his computer, the sound of the keys filling the small space. I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet, counting the bills carefully before placing them on the counter. It was enough, barely. He handed me a key attached to a plastic tag with a number printed on it. "Second floor, end of the hall," he said. I thanked him and made my way to the stairs, each step deliberate, each movement measured. The room was small, a single bed, a chair by the window, a dresser with a mirror that reflected back a woman I barely recognized. I set my suitcases down and stood there for a moment, taking in the space. It was quiet. Not the heavy silence of an empty house, but a temporary kind of quiet, like the room itself knew I would not be staying long. I sat down on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had on the bench earlier. For a long time, I did nothing. Then, slowly, I reached into my purse and took out the envelope. I held it there, unopened, feeling its weight, considering it in a way I had not before. Outside, a car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating the room through the thin curtains. I looked down at the envelope again, then finally slid my finger beneath the flap and opened it, knowing that whatever was inside might be the only thing I had left to stand on. I sat there on the edge of that narrow motel bed, with the envelope open in my hands, the thin paper inside slightly creased from years of being folded and forgotten, and for a moment I did not read it. I just looked at it, as if it might change if I gave it enough time. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning unit, and the soft ticking sound of something inside the wall that reminded me how still everything had become. I finally unfolded the paper slowly, careful not to tear it, and my eyes moved across the lines with a kind of steady focus that surprised me. It was not new information, not really. It was something my late husband had arranged years ago, something he had mentioned once in passing on a quiet evening at our kitchen table, when the world still felt stable and predictable. At the time, I had nodded and let it drift away, trusting that it would never truly matter. But now, sitting in that small room with nothing left of the life I had built, the words on that paper felt different. They felt solid, real in a way nothing else did anymore. It confirmed what I had nearly forgotten. The house had always been in my name, not just shared, not implied, legally mine. My husband had insisted on it after a conversation I barely remembered, something about security, about making sure I would always have a place that no one could take from me. I traced the signature at the bottom of the page with my finger, recognizing the careful way he used to write his name, each letter deliberate and steady. For a moment, I closed my eyes and could almost see him sitting across from me again, his coffee growing cold as he talked about things I had not thought were important enough to hold on to. I opened my eyes and looked at the paper again, this time more carefully, reading every line, every detail. It was not just the ownership of the house. There were notes about insurance, about accounts, about procedures that had been set in place long before any storm had touched our lives. I felt something shift inside me then. Not a rush of emotion, not relief, but something quieter, a kind of clarity. I realized that while I had been standing on that porch earlier, holding on to my suitcases and waiting for my son to tell me where I belonged, there had been something I had not considered. I had assumed that everything connected to my home had been lost, along with the walls and the roof and the furniture. I had assumed that I was left with nothing but what I could carry. But that was not true. Not entirely. I placed the paper carefully on the small table beside the bed and leaned back slightly, letting my hands rest in my lap. The room did not feel as small as it had a few minutes ago. It did not feel as temporary. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of a car passing, then another, life continuing in a steady rhythm that did not depend on me or my circumstances. I thought about Daniel again, about the way he had looked at me, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with something that felt even more distant than that. Indifference. And I realized something else, something that settled into place with the same quiet certainty as the words on the paper. He had not asked me a single question, not about the storm, not about what I had lost, not about where I had been for the past 2 days. He had only told me what I could not have. I sat up slowly and reached for the paper again, folding it carefully along the same lines it had held for years, then placing it back into the envelope with more intention than before. This was not just a document, it was a reminder, a foundation that had not been taken from me, even if I had almost forgotten it existed. I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out at the dimly lit parking lot. The world outside looked ordinary, unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better now. Things had changed, not just because of the storm, but because of what it had revealed. I was not as empty as I had believed when I sat on that park bench. I was not as dependent as I had allowed myself to become. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned away from the window, my movements slow but certain. For the first time since the storm, I was not thinking about where I had been. I was thinking about what still remained. The next morning, I woke up before the sun had fully risen, the room still dim and quiet in a way that felt different from the night before, not as heavy, not as uncertain. For a moment, I lay there without moving, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a car engine starting somewhere outside. Then I sat up slowly, my body stiff from the unfamiliar bed, and reached for the envelope on the nightstand. I did not open it again. I did not need to. I already knew what it contained, and more importantly, what it meant. I got dressed carefully, choosing the same simple clothes I had worn the day before, smoothing the fabric, as if the small act of order could steady everything else. After a moment, I picked up my purse and slipped the envelope inside, making sure it was secure before closing the clasp. When I stepped outside, the air was cool but clearer than it had been, the sky pale with the promise of a new day. The parking lot was nearly empty, and for a moment I stood there, taking it in, allowing myself a brief pause before moving forward. Then I started walking. There was a small coffee shop about half a block away, its lights already on, a faint glow spilling onto the sidewalk. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of coffee and something warm baking in the background. It felt ordinary, comfortingly so. I ordered a small coffee and took a seat by the window, wrapping my hands around the cup as the warmth seeped into my fingers. For the first time since the storm, I allowed myself to think not about what I had lost, but about what needed to be done next. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, hesitating for only a moment before turning it on. The screen lit up with several missed calls and messages, most of them from unknown numbers, a few from neighbors whose names I recognized. I did not open them yet. Instead, I scrolled until I found a number I had not called in years, my husband's attorney. The name sat there quietly on the screen, unchanged, waiting. I pressed call. It rang twice before a voice answered, steady and professional, though older than I remembered. "This is Thomas Green," he said. I took a small breath. "Mr. Green, this is Margaret Collins," I said. There was a brief pause, then a shift in his tone, recognition settling in. "Mrs. Collins," he replied. "It has been a long time." I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me. "Yes, it has," I said. "I need to ask you about some documents my husband prepared years ago, about the house and the insurance." He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply listened as I explained what had happened, my voice calm, measured, as if I were describing something that had happened to someone else. When I finished, there was another brief pause. "Do you still have the documents?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I have them with me." "Good," he replied. "Then you still have more control than you think." The words settled into place quietly but firmly. Control. I had not thought of it that way before. I had been moving from one moment to the next, reacting, adjusting, trying to find somewhere to stand. But this was different. This was something I could hold on to. "I would like you to come by my office today if possible," he continued. "There are things we need to review, especially given the circumstances." I agreed without hesitation, noting the address he gave me and the time he suggested. When the call ended, I set the phone down carefully and looked out the window. People were beginning to move along the sidewalk now, heading to work, to errands, to places where they were expected. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the warmth grounding me in a way I had not felt the day before. For the first time since I stood in front of my son's house, I was not thinking about what he had taken from me. I was thinking about what I still had, and what I was about to reclaim. I arrived at Mr. Green's office 10 minutes early, not because I was in a hurry, but because I did not want to feel like I was chasing anything anymore. The building was older, with a quiet kind of dignity to it, the kind that did not need to prove its importance. I pushed the glass door open and stepped inside, the soft chime above it announcing my arrival. The reception area was modest, clean, with a desk near the window and a few chairs lined neatly against the wall. A woman looked up from her computer and offered a polite smile. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" "I have an appointment with Mr. Green," I replied, my voice steady. "Margaret Collins." She nodded, typing briefly before gesturing toward the seating area. "He will be right with you." I sat down, placing my purse carefully on my lap, my hands resting on top of it. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed thoughts to settle instead of scatter. A few minutes later, a door opened down the hall and Mr. Green stepped out. He looked older, of course, but his posture was the same, straight and composed, his expression attentive without being overly familiar. "Mrs. Collins?" he said, extending his hand. I stood and shook it. "It is good to see you again." "You as well," I replied. He led me into his office, closing the door gently behind us. The space was organized, every file in its place, every surface clear, except for a few neatly stacked folders. He gestured for me to sit, then took his seat across from me, folding his hands together on the desk. "Let us take a look at what you have," he said. I reached into my purse and removed the envelope, placing it in front of him. He opened it carefully, scanning the contents with a practiced eye, his expression unchanged as he read. I watched him, not impatient, not anxious, simply waiting. After a moment, he nodded slightly and set the papers down. "Everything here confirms what you told me," he said. "The property was solely in your name, the insurance policy as well." I felt a quiet steadiness settle deeper inside me. "Then why," I asked, choosing my words carefully, "would I have been made to feel as though I had nothing?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, considering the question. Because, he said finally, when people assume you will not question them, they often behave accordingly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not need to be explained. I nodded once, understanding more than I needed to say. There is something else, he continued, turning one of the pages back toward himself. The insurance claim. It appears a claim has already been initiated. I felt my hands remain still in my lap, but my attention sharpened. By whom? I asked. He glanced up at me, his expression measured. Your son is listed as the point of contact on the initial report. For a moment, the room seemed to grow quieter, as if even the air had paused. I did not react outwardly. I did not need to. The pieces settled into place on their own. The timing, the distance, the absence of questions when I stood at his door. He had already known. Is that allowed? I asked. Not without proper authorization, Mr. Green replied. Not if the property and policy are solely in your name. I let that settle, not as a shock, but as confirmation. What happens next? I asked. He folded his hands again, his tone calm and precise. We correct it, he said. We contact the insurance company, establish you as the rightful claimant, and ensure that all further communication goes through you. If any funds have been redirected improperly, we address that as well. There was no drama in his words, no urgency, just a clear path forward. I nodded slowly. Then let us begin, I said. He gave a small nod in return, already reaching for his phone. As he began making the necessary calls, I sat there quietly, my hands still resting in my lap, my posture unchanged. But inside, something had shifted completely. I was no longer standing outside a closed door, waiting to be let in. I was sitting at a desk, reclaiming what had always been mine. Mr. Green's office remained quiet as he spoke on the phone, his voice calm and precise, outlining details that I understood but did not need to interrupt. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, listening not to every word, but to the direction everything was beginning to take. There was a steadiness in the way he handled each call, a kind of certainty that did not ask for permission, and I realized how different that felt from the uncertainty I had been carrying since the storm. When he finished, he placed the phone back on the desk and looked at me, not with sympathy, but with acknowledgement. It is being corrected, he said simply. I nodded once. That was enough. I did not need reassurances. I needed results. He slid a few documents toward me, indicating where I needed to sign, and I read each line carefully before placing my signature at the bottom, the motion slow and deliberate. My name looked steady on the page, more certain than I had felt the day before. When everything was complete, he gathered the papers into a neat stack. There may be a response once the insurance company updates their records, he said. If your son was involved in initiating the claim, he will likely be notified. I held his gaze for a brief moment, then nodded again. I understand, I replied. There was no anger in my voice, no urgency, just clarity. I stood, smoothing my coat as I did, and extended my hand. Thank you, Mr. Green. He shook it firmly. You are welcome, Mrs. Collins. I left the office the same way I had entered, quietly, without drawing attention. But something about the way I stepped out onto the sidewalk felt different. The air was the same, the street unchanged, but I was no longer carrying the same uncertainty. I began walking, not aimlessly this time, but with direction, even if the destination was not fully formed yet. As I moved along the sidewalk, I reached into my purse and took out my phone, turning it on again. The screen lit up with the same missed calls and messages I had ignored earlier, but now there was something new, a message from Daniel. I looked at it for a moment before opening it. Mom, I think there has been some confusion with the insurance company. We should talk. The words were carefully chosen, neutral, controlled. I read the message once, then again, noting what was there and what was not. There was no mention of how I was, no acknowledgement of the storm, no question about where I had spent the night. Just confusion, just a suggestion to talk. I closed the message without responding and slipped the phone back into my purse. There was nothing to discuss. Not yet. Conversations require a shared understanding of truth, and I could see now that we were not standing on the same ground. I continued walking until I found another small cafe, quieter than the one from the morning, with only a few people seated inside. I stepped in and ordered a cup of tea this time, choosing a seat near the window where I could see the street without being seen too clearly myself. I sat there, the warm cup in my hands, and allowed myself to think, not about the past, but about the pattern that had led me here. It had not started with the storm. It had not started at the front door. It had been building for years in small ways that were easy to overlook. The shortened visits, the conversations that felt more like obligations than connections, the way Jessica would smile without ever asking anything meaningful, the way Daniel would check his watch when I spoke, as if time with me needed to be measured. I had noticed it. Of course I had. But I had chosen to explain it away, to protect the idea of the family I believed we still were. Now, sitting there with everything laid out clearly in front of me, I understood that the storm had not taken anything from me that had not already been slipping away. It had simply revealed what was already gone. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle in, and looked out at the steady movement of people passing by, each of them carrying their own stories, their own decisions. For the first time since I stood on that porch, I was not waiting for someone else to decide where I belonged. I was deciding what I would allow, and more importantly, what I would not. I stayed in that cafe longer than I needed to, not because I was unsure of what to do next, but because I understood the value of stillness before action, the kind of stillness that allows decisions to settle into something unshakable. By the time I finished my tea, the afternoon light had shifted, softer now, stretching across the sidewalk in long, quiet lines. I stood, adjusted my coat, and stepped outside with a sense of direction that had nothing to do with where I was going, and everything to do with what I had already decided. I returned to the motel briefly, not to rest, but to gather myself, to place the envelope back into my suitcase where it belonged, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed and turned on my phone again, scrolling to Daniel's message without hesitation this time. I read it once more, not searching for meaning, but confirming what I already understood. There was no urgency in his words, no concern, just a careful attempt to reposition himself now that something had shifted beyond his control. I pressed the call button. It rang longer than I expected, and for a moment I considered that he might not answer, but then I heard his voice. "Mom," he said, and there was something different in it now, something less certain than before. "Daniel," I replied, my tone even. "You said we should talk." There was a brief pause, the kind that fills with unspoken calculations. "Yes," he said. "I think there has been a misunderstanding with the insurance claim. I was trying to help, but it looks like the paperwork got a little mixed up." I listened without interrupting, letting him finish, letting the explanation take its full shape. "I see," I said when he stopped. "You initiated a claim on a property that is not in your name." Another pause, longer this time. "Well, I thought since I was handling things for you, it would just make the process easier," he replied, his voice tightening slightly. I looked down at my hands, resting calmly in my lap. "You did not ask me," I said. My words were not sharp. They did not need to be. "Mom, I was going to tell you," he added quickly. "There was just a lot going on." I let that settle for a moment, then spoke again, my tone unchanged. "You had time to file paperwork," I said, "but not to ask me where I would sleep." The silence that followed was complete. No explanation came this time, no attempt to soften it. I could almost hear him searching for something that would shift the weight of what had already been said. "That is not fair," he finally replied, but his voice lacked conviction. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window, though I did not look outside. "No," I said quietly, "it is not." I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse him of anything beyond what was already clear. There was no need. Truth does not require volume. "The claim has been corrected," I continued. "Everything will now go through me." Another pause.
shorter this time. "Okay," he said, his tone careful again. "We can figure this out together." I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in understanding. "There is nothing to figure out," I replied. "It has already been handled." I could feel the conversation shifting, not because of anything dramatic, but because control had changed hands. "Mom," he said, and this time there was something closer to uncertainty in his voice, "you are making this sound worse than it is." I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection in the motel mirror across the room. The woman staring back at me looked the same, but something in her posture had changed. "No," I said calmly. "I am seeing it exactly as it is." I did not wait for another response. I did not need one. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," I added, the same words I had spoken before, but this time they carried a different weight. Then I ended the call. The room was quiet again, just as it had been the night before, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt settled. I placed my phone down on the small table and stood there for a moment, not thinking about what had just been said, but about what had finally become clear. Some doors close with a sound, others close without one at all. But either way, once they are closed, you do not stand there waiting. You walk away. The next few days passed quietly, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that mattered was happening beneath the surface, in documents, in calls, in decisions that did not require noise to be effective. I extended my stay at the motel, not out of comfort, but because it served its purpose, a place to rest while everything else was being put back into place. Each morning, I woke up with the same steady clarity, not wondering what I had lost, but reviewing what had already been secured. Mr. Green kept me informed, his updates precise and without unnecessary detail. The insurance company had acknowledged the correction. The claim was now properly assigned. Any attempt to redirect it had been noted and reversed. There were no complications, only adjustments. I listened, asked what needed to be asked, and moved forward without hesitation. On the fourth day, I returned to what remained of my property. The area was quieter now, the immediate aftermath of the storm already beginning to fade into something people would eventually refer to as that week when everything changed. Temporary fencing had been placed around several lots, including mine, and there were workers in the distance, clearing debris, restoring order in a way that felt both practical and indifferent. I stood at the edge of what used to be my front yard, my suitcase set down beside me, though this time it did not feel like all I had. The structure was gone, completely, but the land remained, steady beneath my feet, unchanged in a way that mattered more than I had understood before. I walked a few steps forward, careful where I placed my shoes, and stopped where the front door had once been. There was no marker, no line, but I knew exactly where it had stood. For a moment, I simply looked out across the space, not searching for anything, not expecting anything to be found. Then I turned slightly and noticed a familiar figure approaching from the sidewalk. Daniel. He walked slowly, his hands in his pockets, his posture uncertain in a way I had never seen before. When he reached the edge of the property, he stopped, leaving a small but deliberate distance between us. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter than I remembered. I looked at him, taking in the details I had overlooked before, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes did not quite settle. "Daniel," I replied. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but honest. "I heard you came by," he said. "Mr. Green contacted me." I nodded once. "Yes," I said. He shifted slightly, glancing at the ground before looking back at me. "I did not mean for things to happen like this," he added. The words were careful again, but this time they carried less certainty. I considered them for a moment, not searching for an apology, not expecting one, just hearing them as they were. "Things rarely happen all at once," I said calmly. "They build over time." He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked around at the empty space, as if seeing it for the first time. "I thought I was helping," he said after a moment.
I did not correct him. I did not argue. I simply spoke the truth as I saw it. You made decisions without me, I said. That is not help. The wind moved lightly across the open ground, carrying the faint sound of distant work crews and passing cars. He nodded slowly, absorbing the words without resistance this time. I know that now, he said. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time since I stood on his porch, I did not feel the need to explain anything further. He was no longer a child who needed guidance. He was a man who had made his choices. The claim has been resolved, I said. Everything is in order. He nodded again, a little more firmly. I understand, I replied. Another pause followed, but this one felt different. Not empty, just complete. I picked up my suitcase, the motion simple, deliberate, and turned slightly toward the street. You said you wanted privacy, I said, my voice steady, neither cold nor warm. Now you have it. I did not wait for a response. I did not look back. I walked past him, past the edge of the property, and onto the sidewalk, the ground steady beneath my feet. The wind moved gently at my back, and for the first time since the storm, I was not carrying what had been taken from me. I was carrying only what I had chosen to keep.